When you look a little more closely at the novels of the wonderful British authors who've done so much to make literature great, you'll find a portrait of rural Britain as vividly drawn as any well-written character. Whether the Kent of Charles Dickens, George Eliot's Warwickshire, D.H. Lawrence's Nottinghamshire, the Brontë sisters' Yorkshire, or Thomas Hardy's Wessex, there are so many wonderful places to explore, and Jane Austen's Hampshire is no exception, as you're about to discover.
If I tell you that for many people where I'm now standing is considered to be nothing short of hallowed ground, you might think I've just spent a few hours in the pub. Granted, you see before you a classic example of a fine rural landscape, but it is, when all's said and done, a field, albeit a very lovely one. There is, nonetheless, a very good reason for bringing you here, because on this spot, more than 2 centuries ago, a parsonage once stood, where on the 16th of December 1775, a little later than expected, one of the greatest writers of all time was born. The lady in question, for that is undoubtedly the correct way to address her, despite her humble origins, was none other than Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice, and the creator of literature's favourite couple, the dashingly handsome Mr. Darcy and the truly delectable Elizabeth Bennet. Although there's not a lot to see in Home Meadow, as the field is now known, with the old rectory having been demolished in the 1820s, inside this clump of stinging nettles, you can still find the remnants of the well and old pump that would have served the washhouse in Jane Austen's time. Also, the slope here, we have it on good authority, was one Jane used to enjoy rolling down as a child. In case you're wondering just who that authority might have been, it's none other than the great lady herself, having written about Catherine Morland, a charmingly spirited heroine from Northanger Abbey, doing the exact same thing. You can relax though, you're not going to be subjected to a visual demonstration. I shall have a roll later when everyone else has left. But I would just like to point out this stunning lime tree, which was planted in 1813 by Jane's older brother, James. But before we make the acquaintance of the rest of the Austen family, we'll take a stroll along the lane to find the delightful church of St. Nicholas, which is such an integral part of the Jane Austen story. From the moment you arrive at the church, you can't fail to notice Miss Austen's presence, because it was here that her father, the Reverend George Austen, served as rector throughout her childhood and youthful years. In fact, Jane's brothers James and Henry were subsequent rectors of Steventon, as was her nephew, William Knight, resulting in a family tradition that spanned an incredible, uninterrupted 114 years.
The Reverend George Austen was a scholarly man who'd been proctor of St. John's College, Oxford, who, described as handsome, made an advantageous marriage to Cassandra Lee, the niece of the master of Balliol College. So, if you've ever asked yourself why there are so many clergymen in Jane Austen's novels, you now have the answer, because, as you see, the church was the very foundation of the world in which she lived. By the time the Reverend George moved to Steventon Rectory, he and his wife already had 3 sons, James, George and Edward, and once here they were quickly followed by Henry, and then the first Austen girl, Jane's beloved sister, Cassandra. Brother Frank arrived before Jane's birth in 1775, and last but not least came Brother Charles to complete the family.
Quite a brood all in all. And when you consider that the Reverend Austen also took in students who lived with the family, they must have, on occasion, have filled this lovely little church.
Even in her youth, living here at Steventon, Jane started to write. By the age of 15, when she penned A History of England by a partial, prejudiced and ignorant historian, she was already extremely well read, especially when it came to novels. Also, as Jane grew into a fine-looking young lady, she, along with her sister Cassandra, had certainly attracted the attention of the young men in the district, if the words of their cousin Eliza are to be believed, when she described them as 2 of the prettiest girls in England. It was at this time that Jane started to experiment with novel writing, and her experiences at assemblies and balls held locally, along with social events when visiting relations, all helped to provide the blossoming author with a wealth of romantic material. In 1795, Jane actually attempted a novel of her own, Eleanor and Marianne. And if the names sound familiar, it's because they would evolve to become the Dashwood sisters of Sense and Sensibility fame. A year later, she wrote First Impressions, which so impressed the Reverend George Austen, he sent his daughter's handiwork to a publisher. Sadly, his enthusiasm was not shared by the recipient, who turned it down flat, but as it would reappear as Pride and Prejudice some years later, such fatherly approval was certainly justified. Another early work that would also be retitled was Susan, written in 1798, and this version of what would later become Northanger Abbey focused on a young country girl's introduction to the fashionable society of Bath. This beautiful city, often associated with Jane Austen, provided much inspiration. However, it can come as something of a surprise to discover that Jane actually disliked Bath, although in fairness, this was not altogether the fault of the city. When the Reverend Austen relinquished his duties at Steventon, he chose to retire to Bath, 4 Sydney Place to be precise, and without the financial independence of the Austen boys, Jane and Cassandra had no choice but to leave their beloved Hampshire and exchange their country views for city life. All Jane's progress as an author seemed to come to an abrupt halt. Work on a novel called The Watsons was abandoned, and despite selling the manuscript of Susan for £10, it never appeared in print. The financial constraints on the Austens made life harder than it had ever been at Steventon, and without the advantage of homegrown produce and livestock, these were far from happy times, and matters very suddenly went from bad to worse. When the Reverend George Austen died in January 1805 of an illness he appeared to be recovering from, Bath was forever associated with unhappiness for Jane, and as the Austen ladies were left almost destitute, the future looked decidedly bleak. But during her Bath years, Jane did enjoy one great advantage. Because summers in the city were hot and stuffy, there would be seaside visits that provided her with experiences she would never forget, and thanks to her wonderful writing, they are experiences we can all share.
I'm here at Lyme Regis, walking on the Cobb, immortalised by Jane in her final novel, Persuasion, where her deliciously drawn character, Louisa Musgrove, takes a near-fatal tumble. Actually, Jane Austen devotees will tell you that this is the most exciting attribute of this particular lady, and it is without doubt only because of this remarkable place that she's so often remembered. Even the great Victorian romantic poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, when visiting Lyme, cried out at his guide, "Don't talk to me of the Duke of Monmouth, show me the steps from which Louisa Musgrove fell," proving beyond all doubt just how evocative Jane Austen's description of the event truly was. There was too much wind to make the high part of the new Cobb pleasant for the ladies, and they agreed to get down the steps to the lower, and all were contented to pass quietly and carefully down the steep flight, excepting Louisa. She must be jumped down them by Captain Wentworth. Of course, we all know exactly what is about to happen, and we are not disappointed. She fell on the pavement on the lower Cobb and was taken up lifeless. There was no wound, no blood, no visible bruise, but her eyes were closed. She breathed not. Her face was like death. The horror of that moment to all who stood around. And if you want to know what happens next to poor headstrong Louisa, you'll have to join me again in just a few moments. Welcome back. The news I can report for Louisa Musgrove is good. The rival for the heart and hand of Captain Wentworth, the true love of Persuasion's timid heroine Anne Eliot, Louisa, is granted her survival. But in classic Austen style, she learns the error of her wild ways, leaves Captain Wentworth to the deserving Anne, and becomes engaged to a fine fellow, more suited to her reformed character.
But what, I hear you ask, of Jane? Well, we know that things must have started to look up for the destitute Austen ladies. After all, there are 6 fabulous novels, still in print to this day. And if you'd like to discover where they were written, we need to return to Hampshire and the picturesque village of Chawton.
When you arrive at Chawton, you'll be left in no doubt as to who once lived here, and there's no better place for us to begin than at Jane Austen House.
Now as much a living memorial to the lady in question as it is a museum, Jane moved into Chawton Cottage in 1809, and in this letter to her brother Frank expresses perfectly her hopes and her fears.
As for ourselves, we're very well, as unaffected prose will tell. Our Chawton home, how much we find already in it to our mind, and how convinced that when complete, it will all other houses beat.
This improvement in fortunes for Jane came as a direct result of her brother Edward's rise to prominence as a wealthy gentleman. Having been adopted as the heir of Thomas Knight, Edward had a number of estates at his disposal, one of which was Chawton, and while he could have occupied the nearby great house, he was able to provide Chawton Cottage for his mother and sisters. Today, you'll find many of Jane's personal items here at Chawton. A lock of her hair, still with a glimmer of auburn. The topaz crosses given by brother Charles to Jane and Cassandra. And even the bookcase that belonged to the Reverend George Austen, previously having graced the old rectory at Steventon. But pride of place quite rightly goes to Jane's elegant little writing table, where all of her novels were either revised or written. Here, at the heart of a charming domestic scene, Jane composed her famous tales of love, marriage, wealth and power, while her mother happily tended the garden and Cassandra sat at her sewing or drawing. All of Jane's works were published anonymously during her lifetime, and only her closest family and friends knew of her success. In fact, Visitors who come here all want to see, and for that matter hear, the creaking door that warned Jane of imminent interruptions, and she'd be able to hide her writing away so that nobody would ever guess her secret. Looking around this delightful garden, it's evident that Jane Austen, with her love of the rural landscape, would have been much happier here than in the middle of a big city, no matter how elegant it might have been. By the time Jane reached Chawton, she would also have been all too aware that her chances of marrying and having a family of her own were now gone, which would have made attending all the society balls and assemblies that would once have entertained her all the harder to bear. In no time at all, accepting her lot in life, Jane set to work, transforming Elinor and Marianne into Sense and Sensibility, turning to her memories of the Devon coast as a setting for her tale. Published in 1811, this work by A Lady was a success, and she followed it in 1813 with Pride and Prejudice, perhaps her finest work. Bright, light, sparkling and full of wit and wisdom, the opening lines serve notice that this is an author with a story worth the telling.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be, on his first entering a neighbourhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters.
Later, when Jane was asked for advice on novel writing by her niece Anna, she explained that 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. And with the phenomenal success of Pride and Prejudice that does this very thing, it was evidently advice that was well worth taking. And you only have to take a walk around Chawton, wander amongst the graves at the churchyard where both Mrs. Austen and Cassandra's can be found, to see where so much of her inspiration came from, building on her earlier experiences at Steventon, when the ideas for both Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice had first taken shape. Following the same formula, next came Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion, but with heroines as diverse as anyone could ask, from the terribly wholesome and good Fanny Price to the meddlesome, opinionated Emma Woodhouse and the shy Anne Eliot, who we've already met. And all the while, the beautiful English countryside and ever-changing rural landscape continued to provide the perfect backdrop for Jane's alluring ladies and handsome gentlemen. But if you've been quickly totting that lot up and wondering what happened to the 6th novel, ironically, it's Northanger Abbey. Published posthumously with Persuasion, this was the retitled Susan, which had been wrestled back from the tardy publisher who'd bought it for £10, the first piece of writing Jane Austen ever sold. But there was to be no happy ending for Jane, no Mr. Darcy or Captain Wentworth to whisk her away when all hope of romance was gone. Jane fell ill while working on Persuasion, and although it's now believed she was probably suffering from Addison's disease, there was nothing known of the condition or how to treat it back in the early 1800s.
From struggling to walk and even ride in the donkey carriage that's been so lovingly restored here at Chawton, Jane was taken to Winchester for the best medical care available. In these lodgings, caressed by the shadow of the cathedral, Cassandra nursed her sister until on the 18th of July 1817, at the age of 41, Jane died in Cassandra's arms.
I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can be surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow.
This was a fine epitaph from Cassandra, and if you walk the short distance from College Street to the cathedral and step inside, you'll find the simple memorial stone, a slab on the floor of the north aisle of the nave where our First Lady of Literature was finally laid to rest. But to complete our literary journey through Jane Austen country, we'll return to the cherished home of our authoress and let her words speak out for themselves one more time.
I can't believe my good fortune. I've actually been allowed to sit here at Jane's writing table, and I have in my hands her very own first edition of Sense and Sensibility. Wonderful. Can you imagine the parcel arriving, all wrapped up in brown paper and string, and Jane opening it with trembling fingers, seeing her words at last in print? Magic moment. I've chosen my favourite extract to finish with, naturally out in the countryside, when a pleasant stroll has gone horribly wrong. Poor Marianne Dashwood has stumbled on the hillside, and out of the mist and rain, a hero comes to her rescue. I do hope that Jane would have approved of my choice. A gentleman carrying a gun with 2 pointers playing round him was passing up the hill and within a few yards of Marianne when her accident happened. He put down his gun and ran to her assistance. She had raised herself from the ground, but her foot had been twisted in the fall and she was scarcely able to stand. The gentleman offered his services, and perceiving that her modesty declined what her situation rendered necessary, took her up in his arms without further delay and carried her down the hill.
I do hope you've enjoyed this journey through Jane Austen's Hampshire. I never tire of visiting this beautiful countryside. But if you'd like to continue this exploration of rural Britain, join me next time when we'll be discovering another of the nation's finest landscapes, responsible for inspiring more of literature's best-loved classics.